May 27, 1945, Fort Oglethorpe, Georgia. The war in Europe had been over for just 3 weeks, but for the women stepping off the transport trucks, it didn't feel like victory or peace. Their uniforms, once symbols of loyalty to the Reich, were now badges of defeat. Dust clung to their boots, their faces hollow from rationed bread and sleepless crossings. They had been told that Americans would hate them, that captivity overseas would be punishment for the crimes of their country. Yet as the truck doors opened, what awaited was not anger. A quiet American camp stood before them, neat, orderly, almost unnervingly calm. A sergeant pointed them toward the barracks. No shouting, no rifles raised. Inside, rows of iron beds stretched beneath bare bulbs. On each one lay a folded blanket, a bar of soap, and a mattress that sank when pressed. One woman reached out, touched the fabric, and froze. It was soft, softer than anything she'd felt since the war began. And as the others followed, disbelief spread across the room. A silent realization that even defeat could be met with mercy. The end of the Second World War in Europe arrived not with celebration for all, but with a strange, hollow silence. On May 8, 1945, the guns stopped firing. Yet for millions of Germans, soldiers and civilians alike, the war did not end. It simply changed form. Chaos replaced command, hunger replaced duty, and surrender became the new routine. For the Allied powers, victory came with a new question: what to do with the vast human machinery of the defeated Reich? Among its remnants were not only soldiers, but thousands of women who had served in uniform. By 1945, nearly 500,000 German women had worn the Eagle insignia. They served as Helferinnen, communications operators, nurses, clerks, anti-aircraft auxiliaries, and medical staff scattered across occupied Europe. Some were fanatically devoted. Others had simply followed orders or sought security in uniform. When Allied armies advanced through collapsing German lines, many of these women were captured alongside male soldiers, often in chaotic conditions. Few had any idea that they would be shipped across the Atlantic as prisoners of war. The United States had begun receiving German POWs as early as 1943. Transporting them out of Europe served two purposes. It kept potential resistance far from the front lines, and it helped fill America's wartime labor shortages. By war's end, more than 370,000 Germans were interned on U.S. soil, held in camps scattered from Texas to Wisconsin, from California to Georgia. Among them, though rarely mentioned in reports, were several hundred women. Their journey was long and disorienting. Captured in Europe, they were processed through temporary holding centers in France or Belgium, then herded aboard Liberty ships bound for the United States. The Atlantic crossings were marked not by cruelty, but by a strange detachment. American guards enforced discipline but offered rations and medical care according to the Geneva Convention. For the German women, raised under Nazi propaganda that painted the enemy as savage, such treatment felt almost incomprehensible. When the ships reached the American coast, the contrast deepened. The women were escorted through ports under clear skies, into trains that rattled across vast open countryside. They saw towns untouched by bombs, farms thick with harvest, and shop windows still intact. A living contradiction to the starvation and ruin they had left behind. For the first time, many realized how profoundly the Reich had deceived them. Fort Oglethorpe in Georgia, one of the camps designated for female internees, had been a Women's Army Corps training center before it became a detention site. The Americans repurposed its barracks but maintained military discipline. Each day began with roll call and inspection. Yet within those fences, the POWs found an environment unlike anything they expected. They received 3 meals a day, medical checks, and even limited mail privileges. American Red Cross parcels arrived regularly, and the guards, most of them young men barely older than the prisoners, treated the women with a formality that bordered on courtesy. It was a paradox of captivity. In Germany, Many of these same women had watched Allied prisoners marched through villages under jeers. Now they were on the other side of the wire, and the treatment they received exposed the moral differences between the systems. A few resisted the reality, insisting it was propaganda in disguise. Others, more quietly, began to feel something deeper: shame, confusion, and reluctant gratitude. Official records from the U.S. War Department reveal how carefully the Americans documented prisoner welfare. Reports from 1945 show that female POWs were segregated for privacy and safety, given access to proper sanitation, and even permitted to continue clerical work under supervision. The goal was not revenge but order, to manage the defeated enemy with efficiency, not cruelty. Still, the psychological burden of captivity lingered. These women had served a regime that demanded absolute loyalty. Now, behind American fences, they faced not the brutality they had been warned of, but decency. And that decency unsettled them more than punishment could have. As summer wore on, news of Germany's total ruin filtered through camp radios and letters. Cities reduced to rubble, families scattered, hunger everywhere. And while their homeland bled, these women found themselves sleeping in clean beds, under electric light, with enough to eat. Every comfort felt undeserved, almost shameful. It was this collision between expectation and reality, between propaganda and experience, that began reshaping their understanding of the enemy. Inside Fort Oglethorpe, 618 AT-18C, the daily rhythm settled into something strangely calm. The women worked in the camp kitchens, tended small gardens, or typed reports for their American overseers. There were rules, curfews, and inspections, but no cruelty. Some guards would later admit that they forgot these were the enemy at all, and yet, for the prisoners, each night ended the same way. Lying on those soft American mattresses, staring at the ceiling, thinking of what had been lost, and what might still be learned from the kindness of those they had been taught to hate. The story of German prisoners in America stands apart from nearly every other captivity experience in modern war. It wasn't marked by brutality or starvation, but by an almost unsettling normalcy. For many of the female POWs, the first nights in U.S. camps brought confusion rather than relief. The barracks were clean, meals were predictable, and guards followed strict conduct guidelines set forth by the 1929 Geneva Convention. Yet, it was precisely this unexpected civility that left them disoriented. It contradicted everything they had been told about the enemy. Back in Europe, prisoner camps under German command were often places of humiliation and neglect. Allied captives in Stalag and Oflag compounds endured meager rations, bitter cold, and, at times, open abuse. By contrast, the American detention system was designed to reflect the nation's self-image: disciplined, humane, and morally superior. The U.S. government understood that how it treated enemy captives would echo beyond the war. So, it built a network of over 600 POW camps across 46 states, most hidden in quiet rural areas, away from public attention, but close enough to farms, factories, and railways where prisoners could perform labor. When the female auxiliaries arrived, they entered a system already in full operation. The war had produced a shortage of agricultural labor in the U.S., and POWs became a temporary workforce. Male prisoners worked the fields, built roads, and milled timber. Women were used in less physically demanding roles: clerical work, hospital assistance, or textile repair. Though still behind fences, they saw the everyday rhythm of American life continuing unbroken. Families driving to church, children playing in the streets, stores overflowing with goods. The contrast was haunting. Germany had starved under total war. America, even in wartime, seemed untouched by deprivation. Letters from that period reveal the quiet astonishment of these women. One wrote to her family that The Americans have everything we were told they lacked: bread, laughter, light. Another noted that the guards were stern but never cruel, and that every order comes without shouting. These accounts, preserved in archives decades later, became some of the earliest testaments to the psychological shock of meeting the enemy as a human being rather than a monster. Still, captivity was no kindness. The isolation, the uncertainty of return, and the shame of defeat carved deep emotional scars. Many of the prisoners were barely in their 20s, girls raised under the shadow of the Hitler Youth movement, conditioned to see surrender as dishonor. The camp routine forced them to confront both the collapse of their nation and their own identities within it. Some clung to ideology, others quietly let it die. The American officers overseeing Fort Oglethorpe were aware of this fragile balance. Intelligence divisions hoped to extract information about communications networks, administrative hierarchies, or morale within the collapsing Wehrmacht. Yet interrogations were rarely coercive. A strategy of conversation replaced confrontation. American analysts found that respect yielded more truth than aggression. In reports filed by the U.S. Army's Psychological Warfare Division, officers described these women as bewildered rather than defiant, their belief in Nazi victory already shattered. Within months, the camps developed a rhythm of coexistence. Chaplains organized religious services. Red Cross delegates visited regularly. Prisoners were allowed to receive mail, provided it passed censorship. Some guards smuggled small comforts: a pencil, a bar of chocolate, a newspaper clipping. These gestures, though simple, carried weight. They reminded the women that humanity had survived the war, even if their country had not. The United States, unlike its Soviet or French counterparts, viewed its POWs as temporary guests of circumstance, not enemies to be punished. The War Department's directives emphasized education and reorientation to show German captives how democracy functioned in practice. In several camps, including Oglethorpe, the prisoners were shown films about life in America, its freedoms, and its pluralism. Many found the experience confusing. They had been told that democracy was chaos, that it bred weakness. Yet here it appeared orderly, prosperous, and strangely peaceful. While propaganda on both sides had portrayed women as mere symbols, the protectors, nurses or victims of war, their imprisonment in America revealed something deeper. They were witnesses to a moral contrast that few had expected to survive the war. By late 1945, word of their treatment began to spread through Red Cross channels and repatriated prisoners. For those still trapped in devastated Germany, these stories sounded like fantasies. Beds with linen, warm food, polite guards, such details bordered on disbelief. But for the women living it, the experience became something else entirely: a slow unraveling of fear. As winter approached, the war that had once defined their identity began to feel distant. They were still captives, but the wire no longer symbolized hatred. Instead, it marked the boundary between two worlds, one built on destruction, the other on restraint. And within that boundary, something subtle began to change. The idea of the enemy, once absolute, started to fade. What replaced it would become the quiet center of their memory, a realization that even defeat could reveal a nation's true character. The story of these women cannot be understood merely through the lens of captivity. To grasp its depth, one must explore the layered angles, human, moral, and psychological, that made their experience so unlike any other in wartime history. Every prisoner carried a private history across the Atlantic. Some had volunteered out of conviction, others out of necessity. A few had served as switchboard operators in the Luftwaffe, their voices once relaying commands to squadrons that bombed Allied cities. Others were nurses, who had tended to wounded soldiers on the Eastern Front. By the time they reached America, all those identities had dissolved into a single label: enemy. Yet inside the camps, individuality began to return. The American guards, many of them farm boys from Iowa or Kansas, had never seen the people they were told to hate. What they encountered were young women frightened, disoriented, often barely understanding English. Slowly, the hostility on both sides softened. Guards realized that these women were not soldiers in the traditional sense. They were witnesses swept along by a machine far larger than themselves. The first weeks in captivity were marked by silence. The women avoided eye contact, spoke only in whispers, and refused to eat at times, fearing the food was tainted. But as days passed, the predictability of the routine, roll call, meals, work duty, began to erode suspicion. One American corporal noted in his report, "They were expecting a prison." What they found looked more like a dormitory. To the women, it felt surreal. They were still prisoners of war, yet treated with a decency they had been taught to believe was impossible. For many, it was their first encounter with the idea that humanity could exist outside the boundaries of nationality. For the Americans who guarded them, this was also a moral trial. Some had fought in France, seen the camps at Buchenwald or Dachau, and carried fresh images of atrocity. Now they were told to feed and protect those who wore the same uniform as the perpetrators. It tested their sense of justice. Commanders at Fort Oglethorpe reminded their men that the Geneva Convention was not a privilege, but a principle, a measure of the civilization they were fighting to defend. Treating prisoners humanely was not leniency. It was proof that the Allies were different. Still, not all found it easy. A few guards admitted resentment, wondering why enemy soldiers should sleep on mattresses while Allied wounded lay in crowded hospitals overseas. Yet discipline held. Reports from camp inspections show that violations against prisoners were rare and punished swiftly. The Americans understood that the eyes of history were watching. How they handled the defeated would shape the peace to come. And so, morality was enforced not just as law, but as a kind of quiet dignity. The prisoners, in turn, began to feel its weight. They had believed in a Reich that glorified cruelty and conquest. Now they lived under a system that punished neither. That contrast was more persuasive than any lecture or interrogation. A moral education unfolded without a single word being spoken. Through gestures, through order, through restraint, perhaps the most profound transformation was internal. Captivity stripped away ideology in ways combat never could. For years, Nazi propaganda had portrayed America as decadent, a land of moral decay, ruled by money and chaos. But within weeks at Fort Oglethorpe, those illusions began to fracture. The women saw guards who respected rank but not fear, who followed orders without hatred, who laughed freely yet obeyed discipline. They saw an army that did not demand worship of its leader, nor absolute conformity. The dissonance was powerful. In private, some wrote letters home confessing confusion. One wrote, "If this is the enemy, then everything we were told is a lie." For the Americans, it was equally revealing. They learned that indoctrination could be dismantled not through force, but through decency. Each act of kindness, a shared cigarette, a smile, a gesture of patience during language barriers, became a quiet rebellion against the cruelty of war itself. The psychological tension inside the camp was not between captor and captive, but between old belief and new reality. Every small courtesy deepened the contradiction in the prisoners' minds. They had been raised to equate power with domination. Now they saw a different kind of strength, one grounded in restraint, not violence. By autumn, subtle changes were visible. The prisoners began helping organize their own quarters, volunteering for tasks, even teaching basic German to the guards. Some knitted small gifts for the American nurses. There were still moments of homesickness, grief, and guilt. But the fear that had once filled the camp had largely dissipated. What began as captivity had quietly become an education, not of the classroom, but of the conscience. The same women who once swore loyalty to a regime built on hatred were learning, through lived experience, what humanity could look like when the guns finally fell silent. And yet, beyond those fences, the world they had known was collapsing completely. Cities like Dresden, Hamburg, and Berlin lay in ruins. Families were scattered. Every radio broadcast from Europe brought news of hunger, trials, and denazification. The women listened in silence, torn between shame and relief that they were far away from it all, safe in the country they had once been told to despise. But this was only half of their transformation. What came next would reveal how captivity, compassion, and contradiction could reshape everything they thought they knew. Culture shock does not begin to describe what the German women experienced upon arriving in America. They came from a continent reduced to ash, a place where trains carried rubble instead of passengers, where food was measured in ounces and life in uncertainty. Yet here they found streets intact, towns untouched, and a society that, despite 4 years of global war, still moved with confidence and abundance. Even inside the camp, the evidence of prosperity was constant. The meals, plain by American standards, seemed lavish to women used to thin soup and bread crusts. Each prisoner was issued soap, towels, and basic toiletries, things that had vanished from German shelves years earlier. The electricity never failed. The water ran clear. To them, these weren't luxuries. They were symbols of a world that had survived without losing its humanity. During authorized labor details, some women worked under supervision at nearby factories or farms. They saw American families laughing, couples driving to town, children chasing dogs through open yards. These moments were brief, but unforgettable. "We saw the America our propaganda denied," one prisoner later wrote. "They live in peace even while at war. Their sky has never known bombs." The cultural difference struck deeper than comfort. It shattered an entire worldview. Nazi indoctrination had painted the United States as decadent, corrupt, ruled by chaos and greed. Yet what they witnessed was order, civility, and material stability. For many, the realization was painful. Everything they had believed about the world beyond the Reich was false. In the evenings, the camp's recreation hall offered films, American newsreels, Red Cross educational reels, and occasionally light comedies. The laughter from guards and prisoners mingled in a way that would have been unthinkable months earlier. It wasn't friendship, but recognition, a subtle understanding that humanity existed on both sides of the wire. Being a woman in uniform during the Third Reich was already a paradox. They were trained to serve but not to lead, to support but not to command. Many had joined auxiliary services seeking purpose or protection in a collapsing society. When captured, their gender both spared them and isolated them. In U.S. custody, female POWs were treated under the same Geneva guidelines as men, but with additional considerations. They were housed separately, given privacy, and kept under the supervision of women's units or specially assigned guards. Yet this separation also reinforced their sense of displacement. They were no longer part of the proud Wehrmacht machine, nor were they civilians. They existed in a limbo defined by defeat and difference. Some of the guards struggled with how to treat them. The war had conditioned American soldiers to see Germans as aggressors. Now, standing before them were young women, many barely out of adolescence. It blurred the moral clarity of victory. "You could not look at them and think of war crimes," one American lieutenant later admitted. "You thought of sisters, wives, daughters, people caught in something they didn't choose." That realization created moments of quiet empathy. Women prisoners were often given small responsibilities, running the camp library, mending uniforms, helping in infirmaries. Their competence earned respect. A few even served as translators during interrogations. The Americans began to see them not as enemies, but as reflections of themselves, shaped by different circumstances, yet equally human. Still, gender carried an unspoken weight. The female prisoners felt both shame and relief. shame for being spared the harsher fates of male soldiers, relief that their femininity offered protection rather than danger. Yet this also deepened their inner conflict. They wondered whether mercy was granted because they were women, or because America truly lived by the ideals it claimed. In the evenings, when lights went out and conversation faded, the thoughts grew heavier. They imagined their brothers or fiancés still in captivity, somewhere in France or the Soviet Union, enduring hunger, cold, and humiliation. The guilt of comfort haunted them. The softness of the bed became a daily reminder that their survival was both a blessing and a burden. After the war, most of these women returned to Germany quietly, their experiences largely unspoken. Post-war Germany had little interest in the stories of female auxiliaries, and even less in the idea that the enemy had treated them well. Yet in archives and memoirs, fragments of their voices survived. Letters preserved by the Red Cross and military historians reveal a recurring theme: disbelief. One woman wrote, "I expected hatred, but found something worse. Kindness I could not understand." Another described her first night back in ruined Hamburg. "The bed was hard, the roof was gone, and I dreamed of Georgia." For decades, historians overlooked these testimonies, focusing instead on the larger narratives of reconstruction and guilt. But in the small details, a bar of soap, a clean pillow, a quiet guard, lies a different kind of history, one that shows how moral victory can be achieved without a shot fired. The women's captivity in America became a mirror reflecting the moral contrast between two systems. While Europe struggled with vengeance, the United States demonstrated restraint. While Nazi ideology had glorified hardness and contempt for weakness, the Americans revealed strength through compassion. In the long arc of history, this mattered. When West Germany eventually rose as a democratic ally of the U.S., its moral foundation was not built solely on military defeat, but also on exposure. Exposure to another way of being powerful. The experiences of these women, though small in number, represented the earliest seeds of that understanding. They returned to a homeland in ruins, carrying a story too strange for their neighbors to believe. That in captivity, they had glimpsed freedom. And as those memories followed them into the decades that came, they remained bound not by the fences of Fort Oglethorpe, but by the haunting gentleness of their captors, a gentleness that redefined what it meant to win a war. By late 1945, the rhythm of captivity at Fort Oglethorpe had settled into something almost domestic. The war was over. Germany lay in ruins, its cities unrecognizable, its government dissolved. For the women behind the camp fences, time moved differently, neither forward nor backward, only inward. What began as mere imprisonment had become a confrontation with identity itself. The defining moment of change didn't come through orders or interrogation, but through a series of small, human encounters that stripped away every layer of wartime mythology. It started in the camp infirmary. A young German nurse named Erika Hoffmann, captured in France and now assigned to assist the American medical staff, had once tended Luftwaffe crews in the ruins of Cologne. Her memories of war were steeped in the smell of blood and smoke, and in lectures that described the Allies as beasts, destroyers without mercy. Yet here, under the supervision of an American Army nurse named Margaret Evans, she found herself cleaning wounds of American guards who had injured themselves in camp work. No one shouted. No one humiliated her. Evans even offered her a cup of coffee one morning, saying softly, "You're good at this. You've done this before." The words caught Erika off guard. No rank, no accusation, just acknowledgement. That morning, the two women worked side by side, sharing quiet conversation about nursing, weather, and home. Evans mentioned her brother, still missing in the Pacific. Erika mentioned her mother, lost in a bombing raid. For a few minutes, enemy lines ceased to exist. Stories like that multiplied in silence. American officers noticed the subtle shift in atmosphere. The women began greeting guards instead of avoiding them. They organized evening singing sessions, folk songs from Germany, sometimes joined by curious Americans who recognized the melodies. One night, when a storm knocked out power, the entire barracks filled with candlelight and a strange stillness. From somewhere down the hall, a few prisoners began humming a lullaby. Leise rieselt der Schnee, a song about falling snow and peace. The melody drifted through the camp, echoing off the tin roofs. Outside, an American sentry stood under his poncho and listened. He later wrote in his diary, "It was the first time I felt sorry for them. They sounded like home, not the enemy." For both sides, it was disarming, this slow, quiet collapse of hatred. The war had been fought with absolute moral conviction. But here, behind fences, conviction was replaced by recognition. Humanity, suppressed for 6 brutal years, was surfacing again. Even official reports reflected the change. In late 1945, the War Department's inspection summaries noted that discipline at Fort Oglethorpe was remarkably stable, morale high, and prisoner conduct exemplary. But the language of bureaucracy could never capture what was truly happening. The realization that mercy could disarm more effectively than violence ever could. Christmas. That year brought the turning point into full focus. For the German women, it was the first holiday spent outside Europe, far from family and faith. Many expected it to pass unacknowledged. Instead, on December 24th, the camp commander ordered a modest celebration, a small tree, candles, and a joint service led by an American chaplain fluent in German. Prisoners were allowed to sing carols, and guards stood at the back of the hall, silent but respectful. When the first verse of Stille Nacht began, something in the air changed. Voices, hesitant at first, grew steady, clear, and mournful. Some wept quietly. The chaplain later recalled that it was the sound of 2 nations grieving at once. For the prisoners, it was unbearable and beautiful. The realization that their enemies were granting them dignity even in defeat. After the service, one American sergeant placed a small crate near the doorway. Inside were apples, tobacco, and a few bars of chocolate. "Merry Christmas," he said simply, and walked away. The women stood frozen, unsure how to respond. No one had given them a gift since the war began. That night, many couldn't sleep. Some whispered prayers of gratitude. Others cried silently into their pillows, overwhelmed by emotions they didn't have names for. From that night onward, something irreversible had changed. The prisoners no longer saw themselves merely as captives of war. They had become witnesses to an unexpected kind of power. The power of restraint, of compassion, shown without need for reward. And for the Americans, the experience left its own mark. Guards who had once spoken of the Krauts now used names. They saw fear replaced by familiarity, distance replaced by decency. The fences still stood, but they no longer divided enemy from victor, only people from freedom. In those months, within that quiet Georgia camp, both sides learned the same truth, that humanity could survive war only if it refused to imitate it. But as the new year approached and repatriation orders began to circulate, a different kind of uncertainty crept in for the women. Returning home no longer meant returning to comfort. It meant stepping back into a world their captors had shown could be better. When the new year dawned in 1946, the mood inside Fort Oglethorpe shifted again, not because of cruelty or conflict, but because of the quiet anxiety that comes when the end of something familiar draws near. For months, life behind the wire had grown into a strange rhythm of security. Meals on schedule, work assignments predictable, even laughter returning in small, fragile moments. But now, the rumors had begun. Lists were being drawn, transports arranged, ships readied for repatriation. For most prisoners, the thought of freedom should have sparked joy. Yet for many, it filled them with dread. Germany no longer existed as the country they had served. Cities like Hamburg, Dresden, and Cologne were ash heaps. Homes were gone, families scattered. The uniforms they once wore with pride had become symbols of guilt. To go back meant facing ruins and judgment. Among those waiting was Erika Hoffman, who had become something of a quiet figure of trust within the camp. She'd spent the winter helping the American nurses with medical records, her English improving by necessity, her demeanor softening into calm discipline. The guards respected her. Even the officers recognized her steady presence as essential to keeping order among the new arrivals. But as March approached, Erika found herself staring at the lists with trembling hands, searching for her name, and praying not to find it. One afternoon, she stood outside the infirmary with Corporal James O'Donnell, one of the younger guards assigned to her section. He was barely 22, fresh-faced but hardened by what he'd seen in France. He handed her a clipboard, then hesitated. "You'll be heading home soon," he said quietly. "They say Bremen's the next port for transport." She nodded, though her eyes stayed fixed on the horizon. "Home?" she repeated softly, as if testing the word. "I don't know what that means anymore." O'Donnell didn't answer. He wanted to tell her that no one truly knew what home meant after a war. Not him, not her, not anyone. But he stayed silent, because soldiers didn't speak that kind of truth out loud. In the evenings, conversations like that played out across the camp, whispered through fences, over coffee, through broken translations. A sense of mutual recognition had formed between captor and captive. Both were products of a war they didn't start, both trying to understand what peace would demand of them. For the Americans, there was also unease. The women they had guarded for almost a year had become familiar, human. Sending them back now felt strangely wrong, as though mercy itself were being deported. In early April, an official notice was read aloud in the assembly yard. The first group, 86 women, mostly from the Luftwaffe auxiliaries, would depart in 7 days. They would be transported by rail to New York, then boarded onto the SS Marine Flasher, bound for Bremerhaven. When the announcement ended, a silence swept through the crowd. Some women wept openly. Others stood perfectly still, as if bracing for impact. That evening, the barracks glowed faintly under the dim light of kerosene lamps. A few women gathered in the corner, writing letters, not to family, but to the nurses and guards who had treated them kindly. One note, left folded on a table in the infirmary, read simply, "You have taught us that enemies can be kind. We will not forget this lesson." When the morning of departure came, rain soaked the camp. The women lined up in the mud, carrying what little they had: a blanket, a pair of shoes, a photograph if they were lucky. The Americans stood nearby, some offering cigarettes or brief handshakes. It was supposed to be routine, just another prisoner transfer. But when Erika stepped forward, O'Donnell removed his cap, almost reflexively, and nodded. "Take care of yourself," he said. She looked up, her expression unreadable. Then, after a moment, she replied, "And you? Don't forget what you learned here." He wanted to ask what she meant, but she was already walking toward the trucks. The engines rumbled to life, and the convoy rolled out through the gates for the last time. Rain drummed against the roofs, masking the sound of sobbing inside. Later that day, the camp felt unnaturally empty. The silence that had once been oppressive now felt hollow, as if something vital had been removed. The remaining guards wandered aimlessly, performing tasks out of habit. A sergeant muttered, "Never thought I'd miss the sound of German chatter." In the following weeks, Fort Oglethorpe began its slow dismantling. Barracks were emptied, papers archived, fences torn down. The war had finally, truly ended. But, for those who had lived through that peculiar experiment in humanity, that fragile peace within the aftermath of chaos, the memories would never quite fade. O'Donnell kept one relic from those months, a folded scrap of paper he'd found near the infirmary door after the final transport left. On it, written in faint pencil, were the words, "Mercy is stronger than victory." He carried it home in his breast pocket when he left the army. Years later, when asked about his service, he rarely spoke of battles or medals. He spoke instead of a camp in Georgia and of women who arrived as enemies but left as reminders of what peace was supposed to look like. By the summer of 1946, the Fort Oglethorpe compound had fallen quiet. The barbed wire was gone, the guard towers dismantled. Only the outlines of footpaths remained where hundreds had once marched to roll call under the Georgia sun. Trucks came and went, carrying away the remnants of the war. Crates of uniforms, documents, kitchen equipment, until nothing was left but empty ground and a few weathered signposts. But what lingered wasn't the silence. It was the memory of how something unexpected had happened there, how a prison had become a place of strange compassion. Word of Fort Oglethorpe's treatment of its prisoners had already spread through both American and European channels. Red Cross officials, visiting other POW sites in the U.S., noted that conditions in women's camps often exceeded the Geneva standard. In interviews later conducted by occupation authorities in Germany, several former prisoners spoke with disbelief about the comfort they had found in captivity. One of them, Lieselotte Kruger, a 23-year-old radio operator, told an Allied interpreter, "They gave us beds with sheets, real sheets. I had not slept on one since 1943. We thought they would treat us like we treated others, but they didn't. They wanted us to see that mercy was possible." For many of these women, that realization marked the beginning of a quiet transformation. When they returned to Germany, they found not the nation they had left, but a landscape of wreckage. Entire cities were rubble. Food was scarce. Millions displaced. Yet some carried something intangible from their months in captivity. A changed understanding of the people they had once called enemies. Historians, studying post-war reconciliation, later noted how stories like theirs shaped early German attitudes toward America during the occupation years. The image of the fair guard, of discipline without cruelty, softened what might have otherwise been a climate of bitterness. For some of the women, those memories directly influenced what they would do next. In Bremen, Erika Hoffman found work as a clerk for a U.S. Army logistics office. Her English, learned through nightly conversations in Fort Oglethorpe, made her valuable. When asked once by an officer why she had returned to work with the same flag that once opposed her, she answered simply, "Because they remembered we were human." By late 1947, most of the former Fort Oglethorpe prisoners had been released back into civilian life. A handful wrote letters to their former guards, some even exchanging holiday greetings for years afterward. One American nurse received a package from Stuttgart containing hand-embroidered pillowcases. The note inside read, "To remind you of the soft beds we will never forget." For the United States, the episode barely registered in the public record. The women's camps were footnotes amid the colossal scale of the war. Yet within military archives and oral histories, Fort Oglethorpe's story became a case study in the power of humane conduct. The War Department's 1946 internal report described the camp's administration as efficient, disciplined, and reflective of American standards of decency. Still, not everyone approved. Some veterans criticized the leniency shown toward the enemy, arguing that compassion had no place in a war defined by atrocity. But the officers who had seen the results firsthand disagreed. They understood that strength, shown without cruelty, was not weakness. It was proof of civilization's endurance. The empty grounds of Fort Oglethorpe were eventually turned over to civilian authorities. New buildings rose where the barracks had stood. Decades later, only a few locals remembered what had happened there. But beneath the soil lay traces of a moment when humanity had reasserted itself amid the ruins of hate. A reminder that sometimes the truest victory comes not from domination, but from restraint. And for the women who had once feared punishment more than death, it was the softness of an American bed that stayed with them, the strange, unforgettable comfort that told them the war, at last, was truly over. The journey home was disorienting for many of the former prisoners. Ships crossed the Atlantic, carrying them back to a Germany unrecognizable from the one they had left. The familiar landscapes of their childhood were gone, replaced by flattened cities, shattered homes, and streets filled with rubble and silence. For women like Erica Hoffman, the return felt like stepping from a carefully maintained illusion into chaos. The contrast between the order of Fort Oglethorpe and the devastation awaiting them at Bremerhaven could not have been starker. Many spoke of the emotional dissonance they felt upon landing. Where once they had feared punishment, they now faced questions of survival. Families had been lost, jobs were gone, and the social structures they had once depended upon had collapsed. Yet beneath the fear and despair, the lessons learned in captivity remained. The memory of soft beds, consistent meals, and courteous guards offered a model of civility that contrasted sharply with the ruin and hunger around them. It was a paradox, survival intertwined with guilt and gratitude. Some women found employment with the Allied occupation authorities, often drawing on skills honed in American camps: clerical work, nursing, translation. Tasks that were once part of military service now provided a foothold in rebuilding their lives. Erica, for example, worked with U.S. logistic units in Bremen, her fluency in English and familiarity with American systems making her indispensable. She would later recount that much of her resilience came from months in captivity. "They treated us like people," she said. "That changed everything about how I saw myself and my country." Letters and memoirs from other former prisoners reveal similar patterns. Many returned with a profound understanding of cultural contrast, the stark difference between the ideological world of Nazi Germany and the moral, regulated environment of American camps. They carried with them the memory that a nation could wage war without abandoning humanity. For some, these lessons influenced post-war choices, careers, social attitudes, and even family life were reshaped by those months in captivity. The U.S. military kept detailed records of repatriation, noting not just the safe return of prisoners, but the transformation many had undergone. Reports emphasized their improved physical health, calmer disposition, and willingness to cooperate with Allied authorities. Psychologists studying the POW experience later concluded that humane treatment fostered psychological recovery even amidst the trauma of defeat. These women had entered captivity expecting hardship. They left having internalized a quiet model of stability, dignity, and ethical behavior. Back in Germany, the soft bed became more than just a memory. It became a symbol of contrast, of what could exist in a world untainted by cruelty. Former POWs recounted with striking clarity the sensation of lying down after years of makeshift sleeping arrangements. In the stark ruins of their cities, that memory was a lifeline. It reminded them that survival did not require the abandonment of humanity, that a world could exist where one's adversaries did not need to be enemies in every sense. Some of these women shared their experiences in later memoirs, interviews, or correspondence with American personnel. They spoke less of the uniforms or the battles and more of small, intimate acts. A towel folded neatly, a hot cup of soup, a kind word during an inspection. These details, mundane to the Americans, were extraordinary to women who had endured years of indoctrination and deprivation. The psychological imprint of such care would last a lifetime. Even for the Americans who had served as guards, the aftermath lingered. Letters received over the following decades from former prisoners reminded them that their actions, measured, civil, and humane, had lasting impact. One former guard reflected, "We never thought about medals or recognition. We just followed orders. But those women, they never forgot. And neither did I." By the time the last transport ship sailed, a quiet moral victory had been secured. Not through force of arms, not through victory in battle, but through consistency, restraint, and the deliberate choice to treat the defeated with dignity. The war's violence had ended. The seeds of reconciliation, planted in the most unlikely of places, were beginning to take root. And while Europe struggled with physical reconstruction, the lessons of Fort Oglethorpe endured in the minds and hearts of those who had been there. A testament to the enduring power of compassion, even amidst the aftermath of war. History often measures wars in battles won, territories seized, or leaders toppled. Yet, sometimes, the true measure of a conflict is found not in destruction, but in the small acts that reveal what humanity is capable of, even amid the ruins of ideology. The story of the women prisoners at Fort Oglethorpe is one such measure. For months, they had been told that Americans were cruel, that captivity would be punishment, that mercy was impossible. Instead, they found order, care, and restraint. Beds with linen, warm meals, polite guards. These were not luxuries, but a quiet assertion of moral strength. Every small act of civility became a lesson that power need not be enforced through fear, that dominance can coexist with compassion, and that a nation can remain humane even while waging war. The psychological impact on the prisoners was profound. Ideology, so deeply ingrained over years of indoctrination, began to unravel under the simple weight of kindness. They learned that enemies could act with integrity, that defeat need not mean degradation, and that human dignity could survive even after loyalty to a collapsed regime had been stripped away. For the Americans, the experience confirmed that restraint was not weakness. Treating captives with decency preserved the nation's moral authority and set a precedent for post-war reconstruction and reconciliation. It was a rare demonstration of how ethical conduct could leave a deeper imprint than victory alone. Today, when we reflect on World War II, we often remember the battles, the generals, the weaponry, the sheer scale of destruction. Yet the lessons from Fort Oglethorpe remind us that war is also a human story, and that its true legacies can be measured in moments of quiet courage, mercy, and understanding. In the soft beds of Georgia, the defeated learned that kindness could endure. The victors proved that strength could be tempered with decency, and through those small, seemingly ordinary moments, history recorded something extraordinary. That even in the aftermath of unimaginable conflict, humanity could survive, and, perhaps, begin to heal.